Uhuru. Uhuru. I want to start off by bringing greetings from Cobra, also from the Philadelphia chapter of Cobra, under our past leadership. National male co-chair was here from Philadelphia, Ari Meredazan. We had another sister from the Philadelphia chapter in the house, but she had to go, Sister Nabila. So Cobra wants to bring greetings. Also want to start off by saying that I was texting. I did say that earlier that I co-founded the Amos Wilson Institute, Book Club and Institute of Chicago. That is a political education arm of the movement. I was texting earlier to determine whether or not we could take upon organizational membership with Black Lives Back Coalition. I got a text back that we would, and so we're going to join. If we still have the credit card capabilities, I'll do that before I leave today.
All right.
I entitled this piece, Getting to Reparations, the 21st Century Reparations Paradigm or Manifesto of People of African Descent in America. And what I'm basically saying here is that there's a new paradigm of reparations activism. And it was brought about in 2001, but here it is 2014, and most of us don't even know about it.
Yeah.
And so it kind of reminds me of the Juneteenth piece. You know, it was 3 years, I believe, after our brothers and sisters in Texas found out that there was an end of enslavement. And you wonder, how could these people living in the United States find out about something so significant 3 years later? And it was because the entire system of white supremacy hid that. And it's the same way with this new paradigm shift of reparation activism, that our people, for the most part, have no knowledge of this new shift 13 years later. I introduced this concept called reparations enforcement to our brothers and sisters at the APAC in Johannesburg, South Africa in January this year. There was a young brother in Chicago by the name of J.R. Fleming who started the Chicago Anti-Eviction Campaign around the issue of housing as a human rights violation in the city of Chicago. And this brother did some great work where he brought the United Nations Special Rapporteur to Chicago to investigate these human rights violations in the city of Chicago, with them displacing members out of the families out of the Cabrini Green housing projects. And the brother said that once they got there, he thought that they were going to bring the blue helmets with them. And so the brother from an African brother, who was the special rapporteur, he said, no, that ain't how it works. Now, we're going to come and we're going to investigate, then we're going to make our report, but you all are going to have to make this happen. If there's going to be something that takes place, we can make recommendations, but you all got to make this happen. So he said, man, what we had to do is, he basically told us we had to enforce our human rights. Prior to that, we had been advocating for the human right to housing. Now they began to enforce the human right to housing, where they would get people who were evicted from housing, put them back into their house after foreclosure, and make sure that the police could not come and put them out again. And so they were doing what he called enforcing their human rights to housing. So I said, well, if that's the case around housing, we should be able to do the same thing around reparations, because reparations is also a human right. And most people are not aware of that particular fact. So I'm calling the subtitle of this, the full and comprehensive reparations approach as determined by International Court of Justice, the International Law Commission, and other international law guidelines, how America fulfills the obligation to make full reparations. Now that's a whole lot, and I'm going to kind of explain what all that means. But basically, what we're doing is we're taking this struggle on an international level. What most people don't understand is that there's a tremendous amount of law already in place around reparations, internationally. Not so much here in the United States. Just like there's law around divorce. If you want to divorce someone, you don't have to make up new laws. It's already law. There's law around injury. You don't have to make up new law if someone injures you. There's all type of law already established. There's all type of law around reparations. However, it's been hidden from the people here in America. The focus is to take the human rights law that is abundant and utilize that for our situation here in America. So it's not a civil rights struggle. We've moved reparations from the context of civil rights because it's always been a human rights struggle. Because there's always been a violation of our humanity since 1415. And we're doing what Malcolm X informed us. He said, you don't take the criminal to his court, you take the criminal to the international court. So he's getting us to focus on the international human rights law. And Dr. King, we know that he abandoned the civil rights struggle prior to his death. If you research the speech he gave at Riverside Church, the one that they say marked his death, on Vietnam and human rights, and compare what was going on in Vietnam with what was going on to us here in America, black folk in America, making that human rights connection 10 months prior to his death. He abandoned the civil rights movement and began to focus on human rights, but you have these Negro preachers who are calling themselves followers of King, and they're civil rights leaders. They call themselves civil rights leaders. Yeah. But Dr. King abandoned the civil rights struggle. And we're basically, most importantly, we are building on what took place in Durban, South Africa. The Durban Declaration and Program of Action was an outcome document of this World Conference Against Racism that was held in 2001. And this is extremely important that we know about this particular conference, because this is the particular conference that stated categorically that reparations for people of African descent is a human right. And also we're basing it on the International Covenant for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, for the elimination of all forms of racism, which is abbreviated ICER. This is the International Human Rights Covenant which America has signed. There are many international law covenants, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the International Covenant Against Torture, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and there's other major international covenants or treaties that governments have entered into collectively, for which they should all attempt to honor in the international community as civilized states. Now, the Durban World Conference Against Racism took place in 2001 in Durban, South Africa. There was a preparatory conference meeting. There are 5 regions from which the United Nations divide themselves. There's the European region, there's the GRULAC, or the group of group of Caribbean and Latin American states, the African group, the Asian group, and the North American group, which consists of Canada, North America, and Mexico. So each of these groups have a preparatory conference to determine what type of language they want to include in the outcome document that they wanted to have debated on at the World Conference. So our brothers from the December 12th movement went down to Chile at the Latin American group and persuaded these brothers and sisters that we could not go to Durban with all of our own individual issues as nations. As you know, the Jamaicans can go with their issues, and the Virgin Islanders can go with their issues, and the Panamanians can go with their issues. But as an African people, we need to focus on 3 issues that face all people of African descent. The first issue was that, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but the first issue was that, and I'll just skip it if I do, was that slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, segregation were crimes against humanity. We need to raise this up past above genocide to the level of crimes against humanity, international crimes against humanity. Second, that there was an economic component to racism, meaning that all those countries, European nations that were the victimizers of racism, white supremacy domination, were economically benefited as a result of this this ideologic and this psychology. And that those injuries still remain among African people today. And then finally, the reparations was due. So the Caribbean, the Latin American nations were spooked by the American government and they didn't want to go along. But eventually they persuaded them, and so this language was taken to Durban, and the American government tried as best as they could to get this language out of the preparatory conference document. And once they got to Durban, they tried to persuade nations not to even hear it while the conference was going on. They eventually walked out. Secretary Powell was the Secretary of State. They sent a low-level delegation, and this was the third of 3 world conferences, and the last one hadn't against racism. And the last one hadn't been since 1976, I think, during the Carter administration. So this was a very big international event. Over 4,000 organizers were there, 2,000 members of the heads of state, and over 1,000 reporters were there. So there was over 7,000 or 8,000 people that went to Durban for this World Conference Against Racism. So it was a huge event. And about 400 brothers and sisters from the Americas went, organized by the December 12th movement, NBUF, and COBRA, and some other organizations, and they went there to lobby the heads of state to make sure that this language was not removed from the document. They also had to lobby the Africans because the African states wasn't on it initially. And so they had to lobby them. And so at the conference, they debated this issue, whether or not slavery, the slave trade, colonialism, apartheid, whether it's Jim Crow apartheid here in America or the type of apartheid in South Africa, whether or not these were in fact crimes against humanity. And they determined that they were crimes against humanity. As such, they have no statute of limitations. If the criminal, and it also gave us, this conference gave us new language to use as African people globally. And I'll explain to you how that's being used. But if they were involved in these, or complicit in any way in these activities, and they were still in existence, like America, like France, like Europe, like many of these corporations, that's why we're talking corporations, like institutions, like even families, if they're still in existence, then they're still criminal. Right. They're still guilty today. So time has no factor because they've been raised to the international level of crimes against humanity. 2, they concluded, yes, that those crimes did economically benefit nations and people. And it injured nations and people. And those injuries, just like those benefits, are still existent today. Under international law, you cannot benefit from a crime, no matter how long it took, or when it takes. So you have people today saying, well, that was so long ago. There's nobody living today who enslaved your ancestors, but they still benefiting from the crime. And that makes them criminal. Under international law, let's be clear, not under America's Constitution or the standards here in America, but under international law, you cannot benefit from a crime. So this, and then they finally had the discussion around reparations. They watered down the document, trying to get this language out, but I contend that the language is still there if we look toward other documents under established international law. We can pull out the language in the Durban Declaration and hold it up and say, yes, reparations is still in this document. So that positions us to be reparations enforcers. Now, I just talked about these 3 aspects of the Durban Declaration Program of Action: crimes against humanity, economic basis of reparations, and reparations are due. And here's some of the language. Paragraph 13 in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, it says, we acknowledge that slavery and the slave trade, including the transatlantic slave trade, were appalling tragedies in the history of humanity, not only because of their abhorrent barbarism, but also in terms of their magnitude, organized nature, and especially their negation of the essence of the victims. This is what we call humanicide. Most people don't know that the same author in the 1940s who invented the term genocide also invented a term called humanicide, which is the total killing of a people's humanity. If that is not what took place in fact, they told us that we weren't human, we were property. It's a total killing of our humanity. There's an author in Chicago who's writing a book, and he's a neuroscientist. He's writing a piece called "We Were Never Slaves," and this whole premise is that what took place with us as African people was humanicide. He introduced that term, humanicide, to us in this time, and that it was a singular situation of subjugation unheard of in any annals of history as long as people have been human on this planet. But it says not only because of its organized nature and especially the negation of the essence of the victims, and further acknowledge that slavery and the slave trade are crimes against humanity and should always have been so. That this phrase should always have been so, they insert it to try to say that it wasn't a crime against humanity when it took place because it was legal, right? But the research that this Vienna woman out of Vienna, Austria, I think she's out of Vienna, international law professor, just wrote a book, Slavery Reparations, Time Is Now. She researched international law going back to Kamm and showed systematically how this has always been illegal. Just because these European governments wrote some laws saying it was legal for them, never made it legal because they were always a minority when it came to international law. They didn't even set the standards for international law. So it was always illegal. It was never a time when the type of atrocity that was committed against our people was legal. So no matter that cause is there, we have data showing that it was never legal. Paragraph 15, we recognize that apartheid and genocide in terms of their international law constitutes crime against humanity. The economic basis of racism. We recognize that colonialism has led to racism, racist discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and that Africans and people of African descent and people of Asian descent and indigenous people were victims of colonialism and continue to be victims of its consequences. Talking about today, we acknowledge that the suffering caused by colonialism and affirm that wherever and whenever it occurred, it must be condemned and its reoccurrence prevented. We further regret that the effects and persistence of these structures and practices have been among the factors contributing to the lasting social and economic inequalities in many parts of the world today. So it brings everything current. It connects everything to today. That's when you talk about H.R. 40. H.R. 40, the Commission to Study Reparations Proposals for African Americans Act that John Conyers has introduced, was to study to determine whether or not there were some lingering effects of enslavement on present-day Africans. Well, we don't need that study because the international community has already said it. They declared it. There's an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates that opened up the whole conversation around reparations again. He's making a case for reparations. Durban made the case internationally, and they settled it.
Right.
We don't have to make a case again. And I'm going to talk about that.
Good.
This is the way to talk about reparations is doing. I'm only going to read the highlighted part. With a view to closing those dark chapters in history, we call upon states to take appropriate, 102, we call upon states to take appropriate and effective measures. Appropriate and effective measures under international law are programs for reparations. So when you call upon someone to take appropriate and effective measures or special measures, you're talking about reparative projects. That states take appropriate and effective measures to halt and reverse. Now remember, halt and reverse, the lasting consequences of those practices. We also strongly affirm as a present requirement, and I'm going down, that people have access to justice, including legal assistance where appropriate and effective and appropriate protection and remedies. Remedies, also a term used internationally when referring to reparations, including the right to seek just and adequate reparation or satisfaction. Satisfaction is another term for any damages suffered as a result of such destruction, such discrimination. Now, many people argue that this clause is speaking of current acts, but not past acts. We contend that it's speaking on current and past because of the language used. So again, we're no longer advocates. We're no longer advocating that slavery was evil and that we were injured and the injury remains. That's already been settled. We're not going to make the same argument. It's just like, let me give you two examples where a issue was settled and it makes no sense, and it didn't make any sense, and it wouldn't make any sense, and you will see that it wouldn't make any sense for you to keep arguing the same issue after it had been settled. One was the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, where they ruled that separate education was inherently unequal. The decision was made in 54, but nothing changed after the Supreme Court made the decision. They had to go into Arkansas, I believe it was first, with the 101st Airborne. I think Eisenhower had to send them in to enforce the ruling in order to desegregate the schools. Just making the ruling did not change anything. Mississippi, they had to send in federal troops, the National Guard. Alabama, Arkansas, Ruby Bridges, the U.S. Kennedy sent the U.S. Marshals in to enforce the ruling. So you didn't just get the ruling, you had to have the ruling and an enforcement mechanism behind the ruling. And when we talk about child support as an example, if a sister takes his brother to court and say, Judge, this brother is the father of my child, he's working, he's employed, he should assist with this, with the support and raising of the child. And the judge orders a paternity test and then looks at the economic well-being of the brother, and the maternity test comes back and says, yes, you are the father and you have the ability to help, I'm ordering you to pay child support. If the brother refuses and go home next week, next month, and don't send a check, the sister does not go back to the judge and raise the same argument that he's my father, he should pay. Now she has to go back and get an enforcement mechanism. Judge, he didn't pay, you ordered him to pay, he didn't pay on his own, now I need an order to garnish his wages. If the sister goes back with the same argument, the judge is going to throw it out. I already judged on that. This is how it is since Durbin. We're still making the same argument. The argument has been settled. We're not going to argue about should there be reparations. The international community, 193 states met. America and Israel walked out. Canada and Australia abstained from voting. The other states voted on this issue, and this document is what was produced. We don't have to make the argument about reparations anymore. Now we have to become reparations enforcers. Okay. There's some examples. Zimbabwe. Now, these are 4 different political states where African people find themselves in. Zimbabwe is an African state on the continent. Brazil has a 50 to 60% African population, but it's controlled by European settlers. CARICOM, the Caribbean, are African states outside of the continent. Africans here in America are a minority population, numerically minority population in the European settler states. And Peru is a minority population in a state controlled by some settlers and some of the indigenous people. So you have all these situations, different political settings of African people, but all of them are utilizing the same language that originated out of Durban. That the atrocities that are committed against us were crimes against humanity. The effects are still there, and there are reparations that do. That is the pressing language that has African people globally speaking the same language. When you talk about CARICOM, they're calling these governments criminal governments. When I was talking about North or Southern, I'm speaking the language that they're criminals. This government is a criminal nation in relationship to African people until they repair, until there's reparations. These corporations and institutions. The sister talked about the medical field. There's a sister who wrote a book called Medical Apartheid. Institutions, many of these early medical schools experimented on Africans they call live cadavers. And now what is a live cadaver? You're a cadaver, that means you're dead. Harvard University, this nation's #1 citadel of white supremacy, began as a theological school. We have research to show that some Jews bought Africans off the boat that had the piles, what they call the bloody flux, which is a bloody form of diarrhea, that they were dying, they were going to die in a matter of days. These Jews bought them and sold them to Harvard and other fledgling medical schools. And then they were able to get medical students from all over the world because they could learn medicine on live cadavers. Right? So we have these institutions, they're criminal. We have to speak in this language. Zimbabwe, as we know, they indigenized their land. They took back the land, kicked these criminals out, like in the baking industry, the hair care industry, the tourist industry. You can't even operate a business in Zimbabwe if you're not Zimbabwean in these industries. That's enforcing, and they're utilizing the same language. Enforcing. We have to enforce these rights of our people to be repaired. In Brazil, in 2001, after the Durban World Conference, they came back in 2009 at the review conference and said they went home after the conference. The government, which was the Silva government, had some African ancestry. He knew it. And so the government itself began reparations enforcement. They instituted what they call the Secretariat of Race. And they had a national discussion for a year. And when that discussion was over, they stated that those who were most in need had to be assisted. They looked toward the Quilombos. The Quilombos, it's about 2,000 African communities that were never enslaved in Brazil. Small communities called the Quilombos. They say that they were mostly underdeveloped, and so that development had to go to them first. There's about 14 other indigenous groups in Brazil that development had to go through. They instituted a program of affirmative action on a college level. They had a lot of pushback on that, but they instituted it. They made it illegal for anyone to discriminate against anyone practicing African religion. The only nation on the planet that has a law against discriminating Africans for being African. And when the brother gave this statement, every African in the World Conference, the review conference, got up and gave him a standing ovation. Powerful peace, reparations enforcement. And we know what we're doing in the CARICOM, the Caribbean community. They're threatening to take France, Britain, Belgium, and a few other European nations to the International Court of Justice if they don't deal with this 10-point platform. They're coming out the door saying you're criminals. The international community has spoke. You are criminals. And we are, you look at our nations, we cannot solve our problems. Thank you, my sister. We cannot solve our problems as a region, as states, without this type of repair. And what we're doing in Chicago, I failed to mention that the second appearance in the City Hall chambers, when we raised the issue of there was 33,000 shareholders of this corporation. There were 33,000 Africans in this community where they were setting up, expanding their rail yard. The 33,000 shareholders inherited their wealth, called generational wealth, right? They inherited this $9 billion in wealth. Well, we also say that the 33,000 Africans in this community inherited their poverty. It's called generational poverty, right? And it's because of these corporations' actions that we even in the North, that we even in Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit. If it hadn't been for the sharecropping system, lynching, and the peonage system, we'd still be in the South. So the fact that we're even in Chicago is a result of the criminality of these corporations in this country. And so we brought this all out, and just to kind of see how we kind of conclude on this issue, we brought this out, and when these other organizations that were geared around environmental justice spoke after I spoke, and then the commissioners had a chance to debate amongst themselves. The first commissioner to speak was a brother, elder brother by the name of Bishop Bryant. And he said, I heard a history today, and understanding that history, my conscience would not allow me to vote to proceed with this zoning change until this group had an opportunity to be heard by the railroad, all these groups, all their issues. And so he made the motion that it be delayed for a month. Now, there were 7 issues, Chairman, that these groups had been raising for a year and a half. Issues around the Inglewood community had the highest rate of respiratory disease in the city, asthma and other respiratory diseases, and this expansion of this rail yard with the diesel emission was going to shoot this off the charts. They had university reports, everything. But they were raising these issues for a year and a half, and for a year and a half the railroad ignored them. Say, this is what we're going to do, and we don't care how you feel about it, this is what we're going to do. When we raised the issue of reparations, they came back, excluded us from the conversation. They gave them every issue that they wanted, they addressed the way they wanted it. A year and a half pushback. 1 month delay. The Sun-Times reporters wrote it as, we forced a string of concessions. Environmental groups. They didn't say the reparations group. They said environmental groups forced a string of concessions. So we know this corporation will bend. We know they will bend, but we have to raise up the strength to enforce them to meet the reparations demands that we have, and we believe we can do it. This is really about a lot of the contention that Durban is not as powerful as it is. I got a lot of pushback in South Africa by some of the people who were in Durban, didn't agree that Durban had the strength that I stated it had, and only by looking at what states were doing with it. Not because of what I thought could be done with it, but looking around the world at African people, seeing what they were already doing with Durban, and then the little success we had. Calling these people criminals based on international law, standing on international law, calling them criminals, showing the continuation of the injury, and declaring our human right to be repaired. From this day forward, everybody of African descent should be stating that reparations is a human right. We have a human right, a God-given mandate to enforce the repair of our humanity for ourselves and for our children, and in efforts to redeem the African world as well. In 1 minute, let me just quickly talk about full reparations. In international law, there's guidelines of what they call full reparations. What does full reparations mean? Under full reparations, the first thing is cessation and assurance of non-repetition. Most people, when talk about reparations, they only want to talk about a check. We don't even talk about a check, right? We talk about full reparations. In full reparations, a check may come in there. But full reparations under international law, 1 is cessation, 2 is restitution, meaning returning the people to the place they were if they had not been injured. 3 is compensation, that's the check, and that's setting up a fund. Number 4 is satisfaction. How do you return to these people their dignity? How do you give the African back his good name? Everywhere you go on the planet, African people are looked down upon. That is a result of white supremacy, imperialism, colonialism, racism, apartheid, the crimes against our humanity. Prior to 1415, African people, if you go into their churches, you'll see them worshiping the black woman and her child in Europe, all over the place. We know what the Moors did in Africa and in Europe. So how do we get our respect back? That's satisfaction. Rehabilitation is to get our African minds back. So we say under cessation, we authored a manifesto, which we don't have completed, but we look under all of these issues: cessation, restitution, compensation, satisfaction, and rehabilitation. What processes need to take place under all of these in order for there to be full reparation? It's comprehensive. And the first thing we say under cessation is we want the immediate release of our African freedom fighters who you call political prisoners. You're holding them illegally. That's the first thing you must stop when you talk about reparations. And we go on to some other things, but my time is out. But I want you to understand, when we talk about reparations, it is a human right. What we have experienced, no people on the planet experienced in the annals of human history. And we're still here, and we demand the right to be repaired, and it's up to us to enforce the right, because the international community has already declared it, given us the legal standing to enforce this right, and we expect there to be pushback. We expect for there to be a Ferguson in Chicago, but we got to prepare for that. And we need people to be able to say clearly what we're doing, so they can't color it in the media. And so we just hope that the Black is Black Coalition will be that mouthpiece for us on the national level, so we can declare exactly what we're doing as we fight the structures of imperialism and fight the right to be repaired, the human right to be repaired. Uhuru.